In the year 61 AD, inside a grand house on the streets of Rome, a Roman senator named Pedanius Secundus was found dead, killed by one of his own slaves. Roman law at the time was brutally simple. If a master was murdered by a slave, every single slave living under that roof had to die, guilty or not. 400 men, women, and children were dragged out and executed. But buried inside the records of that massacre is a detail almost nobody talks about. Historians who studied the case noticed something strange. Some of those women were not passive victims waiting for punishment. Some of them had already been fighting back long before that night, in ways the empire never wanted written down. Today, we are going to open a door that most history channels never touch. Not the gladiators, not the emperors, not the wars. We are going to talk about the women Rome enslaved and what happened when they refused to obey. Stay with me until the end, because one of these stories, verified by actual Roman legal texts, will completely change how you see the ancient world. Let's start with something most people don't know. In the Roman world, a slave woman had almost no legal identity. She could not marry. She could not own property. She could not testify in court unless it was under torture, because Roman law assumed a slave would only tell the truth if their body was being broken while they spoke. That single rule tells you everything about how the system viewed them. Not as people who could be trusted, but as tools that needed pain to become honest. And yet, despite having no legal voice, these women found ways to resist, and Roman writers, without meaning to, left behind the evidence. Take the Roman agricultural writer Columella, who wrote detailed instructions for managing a farming estate. Buried inside his practical advice about crops and livestock is a chilling passage about female slaves. He recommended that a woman who bore multiple children be rewarded with lighter work or even freedom. On the surface, it sounds almost generous, but historians reading between the lines see something else entirely. This was not a reward. It was a management strategy, because Roman landowners had a problem. Enslaved women were refusing to have children. Some historians believe this was a quiet form of resistance, women denying their masters the one thing slavery depended on most, the next generation of free labor. If a woman could not fight her master with a sword, she could fight him with her own body, by refusing to bring new slaves into a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting, because Rome did not just face quiet resistance, it faced open defiance, and the empire tried very hard to bury it. There is a term in Roman law, ancilla, simply meaning a female slave. But legal scholars have found something odd scattered across the digest, the massive legal compilation created under Emperor Justinian centuries later, which preserved much older Roman legal opinions. Buried in those texts are references to cases of enslaved women who attacked, poisoned, or otherwise harmed the men who controlled them. And critically, Roman law treated poisoning differently than almost any other crime, because poisoning did not require strength. It did not require a weapon a guard could see coming. It required only knowledge, patience, and access to a kitchen. Roman sources, including the historian Tacitus, describe poison as the method feared most in wealthy households, precisely because it was the one weapon available to people who otherwise had none, servants, wives, and enslaved women among them. Some modern historians studying Roman criminal law argue that poisoning cases involving enslaved women were likely underreported in official records, not because they were rare, but because a household admitting it had been poisoned by its own slave was admitting something far more dangerous. It was admitting that the system of total control Rome depended on could fail. This is the part almost nobody covers, because it complicates the story Rome wanted told. The empire wanted its enslaved population to appear obedient, grateful, even loyal. Roman funerary inscriptions often describe deceased slaves using words like faithful and devoted. But historians studying these same inscriptions have found a pattern that contradicts the polished language. Many of these memorial stones were commissioned by the slave owners themselves. They were not the words of the enslaved. They were the words their masters wanted history to remember, carved in stone after the woman herself had no ability to object. So what happened when resistance moved from poison and quiet defiance into something Rome could not ignore? This is where we reach one of the most extraordinary and least discussed events tied to enslaved women in the ancient world: the uprisings in Sicily during the 2nd century BC. Most people who have heard of Roman slave revolts know Spartacus. Almost nobody has heard what came before him decades earlier on the island of Sicily, where two massive slave uprisings shook Roman control to its core. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, writing not long after these events, described the brutal conditions on Sicilian estates that pushed thousands of enslaved people, men and women together, into open revolt. Diodorus specifically records that enslaved women played active roles in these uprisings, not simply as bystanders, but as participants inside a rebel movement that, for a period of time, actually controlled territory and functioned with its own leadership. Entire towns fell under rebel control. A former slave named Eunice even took the title of king. And while Roman sources, written by the very society that crushed these revolts, focus heavily on the male leaders, the presence of women inside these rebel strongholds is documented, even if their individual names were rarely recorded. Ancient historians simply did not consider it important to write down which enslaved woman fought, cooked for, organized, or led alongside rebel forces. Their courage survived only as a footnote inside someone else's story. That erasure is not an accident. It is the entire point of how Roman history has come down to us. The people who wrote the surviving texts were, almost without exception, free Roman men. They wrote about slaves the way they wrote about property, mentioned only when relevant to a master's story, which means every act of resistance we do know about from enslaved women survived by pure accident, buried inside legal complaints, agricultural manuals, or brief lines in historians who were really writing about someone else entirely. But accidents leave clues, and clues add up. Consider the Roman legal concept of manumission, the formal freeing of a slave. Roman law allowed a master to free a slave through several methods, and thousands of inscriptions across the empire record freedwomen who eventually gained citizenship and even modest wealth. On the surface, this looks like proof of Roman generosity. Historians studying these records more closely have found a much colder explanation. Manumission was often a calculated financial decision. An aging slave cost money to feed and house. A freed slave, especially one who had built skills as a household manager, weaver, or midwife, could become a paying client instead, tied to her former master through an ongoing legal relationship called patronage that still limited her freedom in very real ways. Freedom in Rome, even when granted, rarely meant true independence. It meant trading one form of control for a slightly less brutal one. And yet, within these limits, some women built lives that defied every expectation. Roman inscriptions record freedwomen who became successful businesswomen, running shops, managing property, even employing other workers, including former slaves themselves. One of the more remarkable documented cases involves freedwomen in the city of Pompeii, preserved through the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Wall inscriptions and property records excavated from the ruins show freedwomen listed as owners of bakeries, taverns, and rental properties. These were women who had once been legally considered objects, who somehow, against every structure built to keep them powerless, ended up owning the very buildings other people worked inside. So what does all of this actually tell us? It tells us that the story of Roman slavery we usually hear, the gladiators, the emperors, the grand architecture, is only one layer of a much deeper history. Underneath it is a quieter, more difficult story of women who had almost no legal power, who lived under constant threat of violence and total control, and who still found ways to resist, whether through refusing to bear children, through the fear they instilled with the mere possibility of poison, through joining armed uprisings most textbooks reduced to a single male name, or through slowly, patiently building an independent life. The moment freedom, however limited, came within reach. Historians are still piecing this story together today, using legal texts, inscriptions, and archaeological finds, precisely because the people who lived it were never given the chance to write it themselves. Every fragment we have is a woman who almost disappeared from history completely, and didn't. If this kind of hidden history interests you, the kind buried under the more famous stories everyone already knows, make sure you are subscribed, because there are far more of these stories waiting to be uncovered, stories Rome tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever tell.